This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. The U.S. economy added 227,000 jobs in November, many of them in education and healthcare. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate ticked up slightly from 4.1 to 4.2%. Here to help us make sense of this and what it could mean for you is Diane Swonk, chief economist at the audit, tax, and advisory firm KPMG. Welcome back, Diane.
Great to be here.
So the jobs report out Friday, it showed that November was the sixth straight month with unemployment north of 4%. But nearly 300,000 jobs added isn't too shabby. So what is your biggest takeaway from this latest batch of economic data?
What we saw was the bounce back from everything from a strike in the aerospace industry to storms, that two monster storms, Helene and Milton, that hit and disrupted a lot of employment in the month of October. And so the good news is we saw a bounce back. The 3-month moving average picked up again, but gains have been really dominated. 70% of all net new job gains since June of 2023 have come from only three sectors, and that is healthcare and social assistance, which includes childcare, leisure and hospitality, and state and local government spending. That's important because those three legs have been the support and the least interest rate sensitive sectors that have held the economy up in terms of the employment situation for much of the last year and a half, and continue to dominate gains in the month of November, even though we had these sort of recovery from strike and storm. So the good news is we continue to generate a lot of jobs. Hours worked actually picked up a little bit after being disrupted. What I am worried about are the disruptions that we're seeing, though, that are longer term. Over the last 4 months, we've seen participation among women, mostly prime age women, in the labor force come off its record highs. And that's important because what we're seeing is many more disruptions due to childcare and daycare needs. And this has been something that is in a crisis. The care economy overall
Yeah.
is in a crisis. And that's something that is continuing to hit many households, especially working parents who are trying to make ends meet in this economy.
I want you to just explain something for the layman. How can the unemployment rate rise when the economy adds hundreds of thousands of jobs?
It's a great question, and the issue is there are two different surveys, first of all, and so in any given month, they might not capture the same things. The unemployment rate is measured by the household survey, and the establishment survey that counts the number of jobs net on any given month. That's where we get the job gains from. In general, we need over about 150,000 jobs each month to keep the unemployment rate stable. That may have actually changed with productivity improvements over the last year, but at the end of the day, it's important to remember that we have seen job gains slow pretty dramatically from that red hot pace we saw at the beginning of reopening 2 years ago. And as the job gains have sort of started to settle down, we've seen the demand of workers more in line with the supply of workers. Now, average hourly earnings are still running well above where they were pre-pandemic, which is good, but you need that over a very long period of time to recoup what was lost to the surge, of course, in inflation.
For years now, the Federal Reserve's been seeking a so-called soft landing where we get inflation in check without causing a recession. Are these numbers just one more signal that we are landing softly?
The moment, yes, they are. What's worrisome is we're going to get yet another round of inflation data this week, and it's likely to show that inflation has gotten stickier. We've seen inflation sort of settle down, underlying inflation, overall inflation on the CPI, sort of settle down in the 2.5 to 2.75% range. But service sector inflation, the underlying inflation, which has been stickier in general, looks like it might have reaccelerated in recent months. And that's going to be key to determining whether or not the Fed continues to cut rates at its December meeting, which is now, we're in the blackout period for, which is now just a week and a half away.
Mm.
Our own bet is that it's about a flip of a coin, and that the Fed might not only skip the December cut, it may decide to move back to the sidelines a bit in order to allow inflation to continue to cool, especially as we move into the next year, given the stickier inflation that we're seeing in the service sector. And anyone who's been on the roads or out to O'Hare, you know how many people are certainly travel and tourism and how much that has come back
Right.
recently as well.
Yeah, interesting. We spoke with Chicago Fed Chair Austin Goolsbee after one of the Fed's recent interest cut rates. We talked quite a bit in that conversation about the economic vibes. Even if the economy is performing fairly well, Diane, people don't always feel like it's working for them. What do you make of that disconnect?
I think that's a really important disconnect, and it's something that we don't have any muscle memory. We've not had inflation like the kind we had coming out of the pandemic for decades. And the reality of it, it's been global in scope. We've seen a record number of elections over the democracies and non-democracies, and a record number of incumbents have lost ground in 2024, as we saw in the burn of inflation, the cumulative effects of that really settle in. And I think that's part of the issue is, the Federal Reserve is on one side of the equation looking at the pace of increase of prices, where a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, the level of prices are still way above where they were in 2019 before we got into the pandemic. And even though my wages have come on up, let's face it, wages were stagnating for the better part of 2 decades. And so they needed to see that acceleration in wages. They just didn't want to see the heat that came with it. And it really takes a long time to regain what was lost in an economy where so many things that are so important
Yeah.
cost so much more, like housing and shelter and the insurance just to buy a home. Even if you are able to get into the door and buy a first time home, you're still frozen out by affordability, which a lot of factors have pushed to record lows, despite the fact that interest rates are not at a record high.
Yeah, well, all of this is why, we would agree that the economy was the top issue in the presidential race. So as the Trump administration begins to implement its economic policies, Diane, what are you keeping an eye on?
Well, what we're watching most is, the sequencing of what they intend to do, the issues on tariffs and curbs on immigration. Much of the soft landing scenario, which the Fed itself has leaned into, was due to not only us having this surge in job demand, but also we had a surge in supply related to an influx of immigration. As you slow that down, the balance between demand and supply in the labor market could be less in balance, and that could undermine the soft landing scenario that the Fed has really relied on so far. And so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, tariffs are inflationary. It's something the Fed will not front run the administration on any increases in tariffs, because until we see them, until we see the scope of what they're actually talking about and whether or not they go through with all of their promises, because what a candidate promises on the campaign trail can be very large and lag what a candidate actually does in practice. We don't know how much of this is negotiating issues, but nonetheless, if they were to move on tariffs in a big way, that along with curbs and immigration tend to both stoke inflation and stem growth. And that's a much harder position for the Federal Reserve to be in. And in fact, we saw consumers really reflect that in the first initial read of the Consumer Sentiment Index that came out on Friday for the month of December. We saw the largest improvement in buying conditions for big ticket items we have seen in ages, and the highest consumer sentiment figure since April of 2024, as consumers rushed to buy big ticket items ahead of what they said were feared increases due to the increase in tariffs next
Mm,
year. Now, that kind of movement and behavior, that vibe is actually the exact opposite of what the Federal
right.
Reserve wants, because it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more you spur demand today and buy ahead of prices is the more that price hikes is the more that we're not actually in an environment that's price stability.
So speaking of Friday's numbers, I mean, we saw the most job gains in education and health and leisure and hospitality. Were there any surprises there for you?
Much of it was really coming back. Those are sectors that have been strong. They continue to be strong. The manufacturing sector also saw a little bit of a snapback from the aerospace strike, although outside of manufacturing, you continue to see a lot of weakness outside of that strike come back as striking workers came back to work. And that's where it's been sort of a tale of two economies out there. This has always been this dissonance since the economy has reopened, that even as the economy continues to generate jobs, certain sectors of the economy have not performed as well. And the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, and those sensitive to what is now a very strong dollar, which means exports are being suppressed. It's very cheap for us to go abroad
Hmm.
and go on trips abroad, but it's not as cheap for us to export goods abroad. And it's less expensive for us to import those goods from abroad. So all of those things together leave us with an economy where you're still seeing job gains really dominated despite, an outsized first rate cut by the Fed of 0.5% in September, another quarter point. But the interest rate sensitive sectors really haven't picked up the baton yet from those less interest rate sensitive sectors that have been the drivers of gains for so long now.
One interesting tidbit in the report was average hourly wages grew 4% from a year ago. What do you make of that?
So we've seen average hourly earnings move up and stay in this sort of 4% rate. They're not as high as they were, when we were in the height of the hiring frenzy in 2022. At one point in time in the middle of 2022, those people who hop jobs were getting well into the double digits on a job premium in terms of their pay for hopping jobs. That has now evaporated much, but we are still seeing wages outpace where they were pre-pandemic. And the good news, I think, in the US economy is the pickup in productivity growth that we've seen is that even though inflation looks like it may not be improving as much as we'd like, it's not coming from the labor market that we're seeing some stickiness. It's more that there's scarcities, in fact, due to everything from disruptions to extreme weather events, like we saw with Hurricanes Helene and Milton, and also this fear of the geopolitical situation we're in, where people may actually buy ahead of tariffs going forward. So those things are important to remember, is that the US economy is generating wages at a faster pace than it did pre-pandemic. And I think some of those increases are more than justified by the acceleration in productivity growth we've
Mm.
seen.
We're also seeing more people out of work for longer periods. According to the report, more than 1.6 million people had been searching for a job for more than 26 weeks. That's the highest in nearly 3 years. What's driving that trend?
Again, this is the slowing down of the US economy, and we no longer have the frenzy where anyone and everyone could get a job all at once. We are watching that part of it very closely
Hmm.
because we do worry that the longer it takes, it's still not dramatically out of line with where we were pre-pandemic, which was still a very tight labor market, although it is starting to move up, and we don't want to keep moving up in those areas because that would derail the soft landing scenario. We also saw in the month of November the improvement in consumer confidence, which is a different survey. The survey by the Conference Board saw all of the improvement was in ages below 35 years of age. Now, that's where there'd been a lot of deterioration because that longer to take a job was really showing up in new college grads. That seems to be now starting to recede a little bit. So there could be some good news on the horizon, but we have to sustain it. And at the moment, we're still in the place where it's not as easy to find a job as it was certainly during the hiring frenzy a little over 2 years ago, but it's also starting to get a little bit harder in general. And that is something we don't want to sort of get going in any way because that would completely derail the whole idea of a soft landing.
Well, overall, Diane, what could this jobs report mean for us here in Illinois and in the Chicago area?
Well, we're still in a situation where the US economy continues to cool, but is still expanding. That's the good news. That's what we want to take home. It's still going to be, a very tourist driven holiday season. I do think we're going to see a lot of big ticket spending due to the fact that a lot of people have to replace and repair property destroyed during two monster hurricanes, and that has spillover effects for us in the Midwest. Even though we didn't experience the worst of those events, there is no Las Vegas in the global economy, nor in the U.S. economy, and that is whatever happens, it has ripple effects that we feel in our own wallets here in Chicago. You're even seeing it in terms of the bird flu that's still going on out there and how that's boosted the cost of eggs, a very important protein, along with other protein costs. And those are all things that are affecting us right now. So even though the economy is still doing well, we're not seeing as cool of inflation and as much progress on inflation as we would like. And that little bit stickier of inflation is more of a heat wave than the Federal Reserve would like as we enter into 2025.
We've been speaking with Diane Swonk, chief economist at the audit, tax, and advisory firm KPMG. Thank you so much for breaking this down for us, Diane.